Margaret had expected dust and cobwebs when she inherited her grandfather's remote cabin in the Appalachian mountains. What she hadn't expected was the chest hidden beneath loose floorboards in the bedroom, or the stack of yellowed letters tied with a faded ribbon inside. The cabin had sat empty for 3 months since Grandpa Samuel's funeral, and Margaret thought she knew everything about the man who raised her after her parents died. He was a quiet woodworker, a gentle soul who taught her to fish and told her bedtime stories about brave princesses. But the letters spoke of classified missions, code names, and a love affair that spanned decades with a woman Margaret had never heard of. The recordings revealed a voice she recognized, but words she'd never imagined him speaking. What other secrets had Samuel Carter kept buried in these mountains for 60 years? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The 3-hour drive from Charleston had given Margaret plenty of time to think, though she'd spent most of it trying not to. The winding mountain roads demanded attention, each curve revealing another vista of rolling green hills that seemed to stretch forever into the hazy distance. She'd made this journey countless times as a child, always with Samuel behind the wheel of his old Ford pickup, always with the promise of adventure, waiting at the cabin. Now the silence felt different, heavier. Margaret pulled into the familiar gravel drive as the afternoon sun filtered through the canopy of oak and maple trees that surrounded the property. The cabin looked smaller than she remembered, though perhaps that was simply the perspective of 32 years instead of 12. The log walls had weathered to a soft grey, and the green metal roof showed patches of rust around the edges. Samuel's rocking chair still sat on the covered porch, positioned to catch the morning light and overlook the valley below. She sat in her Honda for a moment, engine ticking as it cooled, and tried to summon the courage to go inside. 3 months had passed since the funeral. 3 months since she'd stood beside Samuel's grave and listened to the pastor speak about a man of quiet faith and gentle strength. The whole town had turned out. Samuel Carter had been beloved by everyone who knew him, or thought they knew him. The keys felt cold in her palm as she approached the front door. Samuel had given her a set years ago, telling her the cabin would always be her home if she needed it. She'd never imagined she'd inherit it outright, along with the small trust fund he'd somehow accumulated on a woodworker's income. The lawyer had seemed as surprised as Margaret about the size of the estate. The door opened with the familiar creak she remembered from childhood visits. Inside, dust motes danced in the slanted light streaming through windows that hadn't been cleaned in months. The living room looked exactly as Samuel had left it. His reading chair positioned beside the stone fireplace, a half-finished crossword puzzle on the side table, reading glasses folded neatly beside it. The silence was profound, broken only by the settling sounds of old wood and the distant call of a hawk somewhere in the mountains. Margaret moved through the space slowly, trailing her fingers along the furniture Samuel had built with his own hands. The dining table where she'd done homework while he worked nearby. The kitchen cabinets he'd crafted from local cherry wood, their surfaces smooth as silk from years of use. Everything spoke of patience, craftsmanship, and a deep love for creating beautiful things that would last. The workshop occupied the cabin's entire back section, accessible through a door beside the kitchen. Margaret had spent countless hours here as a child, watching Samuel transform rough lumber into elegant furniture. The familiar scents of wood shavings and linseed oil enveloped her as she stepped inside. Tools hung in precise order on pegboard walls, each implement clean and properly maintained even months after Samuel's death. His workbench dominated the center of the space, its surface scarred from decades of use but still level and true. Scattered across it were the remnants of his final project, pieces of what looked like a jewelry box, the wood grain carefully matched and the joints cut with characteristic precision. Margaret picked up one of the pieces, marveling at the smoothness of the surface and the complexity of the joinery. It was then she noticed the leather-bound notebook lying open beside the wood pieces. Samuel's workshop journal, where he'd recorded measurements, sketched designs, and tracked the progress of his projects. Margaret had seen him writing in it countless times. His careful script filling page after page with technical notes and observations about different wood species and finishing techniques. She flipped through the familiar pages, smiling at sketches of furniture she recognized throughout the cabin. But as she moved deeper into the journal, her smile faded. Interspersed with normal workshop notes were entries that made no sense. Coded abbreviations, number sequences, references to packages delivered, and routes secured. What looked like map coordinates were scribbled in margins beside lumber calculations. One entry caught her attention. ELR confirmed safe passage. 3 packages to Way Station 7. Weather conditions favorable for mountain crossing. The date was from just 2 years ago. Margaret stared at the page, trying to reconcile these cryptic notes with the grandfather she'd known. Samuel had never mentioned anything about packages or routes or way station locations. She continued reading, finding more anomalies scattered throughout years of otherwise normal workshop documentation. The coded entries seemed to follow patterns, appearing in clusters every few months, with gaps of normal woodworking notes between them. Whatever Samuel had been involved in, it had been ongoing for years, possibly decades. Margaret closed the journal carefully and looked around the workshop with new eyes. What else had Samuel hidden in plain sight? Margaret spent the next hour systematically examining every corner of the workshop, searching for more clues about Samuel's mysterious activities. The coded entries in his journal had shattered her comfortable assumptions about the man who'd raised her, leaving her with an uncomfortable mixture of curiosity and dread about what else she might find. She remembered being 8 years old, standing on a wooden stool beside this same workbench, while Samuel guided her small hands as she learned to use a chisel. His patient voice explaining how wood had grain and character, how each piece wanted to become something specific if you knew how to listen to it. He'd taught her that woodworking was about partnership between craftsman and material, about respecting the natural beauty that already existed. Those lessons had shaped more than her occasional hobby projects. They'd influenced how she approached problems in her corporate consulting job, how she'd tried to save her marriage to David, how she generally moved through the world. Samuel's philosophy of patience and careful observation had become her own, though she wondered now if there were layers to his teaching she'd never understood. The marriage to David had ended 6 months ago, another casualty of her inability to commit fully to anything that didn't feel authentic. He'd accused her of being emotionally unavailable, of holding everyone at arm's length. Maybe he'd been right. Maybe growing up with only Samuel for family had left her unprepared for the messy intimacy of adult relationships. Her phone buzzed with a text from her friend Lisa. "How's the cabin cleanup going? You finding any treasures?" Margaret stared at the message, unsure how to respond. What did you tell someone when you discovered your beloved grandfather might have been living a double life? She pocketed the phone and continued her exploration. A tall cabinet in the corner held Samuel's collection of hand tools, some of them antiques passed down from his own father. Margaret opened each drawer methodically, finding the expected chisels and planes and measuring devices. But in the bottom drawer, wrapped in soft cloth, was something she'd never seen before. The chess set was extraordinary. Each piece had been carved from different woods, creating a stunning visual contrast between the light and dark armies. The white pieces gleamed with the pale elegance of maple and birch, while the black pieces showed the rich depth of walnut and cherry. The craftsmanship was beyond anything Margaret had seen Samuel create. Each figure detailed and expressive despite their small size. She lifted the white king, marveling at the intricacy of the carved crown and robes. The wood was smooth as marble, polished to a lustrous finish that spoke of countless hours of patient work. As she turned the piece to examine it from different angles, she noticed something odd about the base. Tiny letters had been carved into the wood, so small they were barely visible, Squinting, she could make out the initials SC carved in minute script. Samuel Carter. She examined the White Queen and found different initials. ER. The bishops, knights, and rooks each bore their own sets of initials, none of which she recognized. Moving to the black pieces, she found the same pattern. Each figure represented someone specific, though only Samuel's piece among the White Army was familiar to her. The Black King bore the initials VM and had been carved with a particularly menacing expression. Margaret studied the piece, noting the sharp angles of the face and the aggressive posture. Whoever VM represented, Samuel had not thought kindly of them. The other black pieces showed varying degrees of detail and expression, as if Samuel had known some of the people they represented better than others. Margaret set up the board according to the traditional arrangement, creating two opposing armies of anonymous individuals from Samuel's mysterious past. The White Queen, marked ER, commanded particular attention. She'd been carved with exceptional care, her face serene but determined, her posture regal but approachable. Samuel had clearly held deep affection for whoever this piece represented. As she studied the completed board, Margaret realized she was looking at a map of Samuel's secret world. These weren't just chess pieces. They were a record of the players in whatever game he'd been involved in. The question was whether it had been a game with rules and honor, or something darker and more dangerous. The workshop's landline phone rang suddenly, its shrill tone cutting through the afternoon silence. Margaret jumped, nearly knocking over the White Queen. The caller ID showed a local number she didn't recognize. After 4 rings, she decided to answer. "Hello? Is this Margaret?" The voice belonged to a man, probably middle-aged, with the careful cadence of someone choosing his words deliberately. "Yes. Who is this?" "My name is Jake Morrison. I live about 2 miles down the mountain from Samuel's place. I was wondering if you might have time for a visit." Margaret agreed to meet Jake Morrison the following morning, her curiosity about Samuel's neighbor outweighing her caution. After ending the call, she decided to tackle the systematic cleaning she'd originally come to do. Perhaps focusing on practical tasks would help her process the growing mystery surrounding her grandfather's life. She started with the kitchen, wiping down surfaces and organizing cabinets that had remained untouched since Samuel's death. The familiar routine of cleaning provided comfort, reminding her of countless childhood visits when she'd helped Samuel maintain the cabin. He'd always insisted that taking care of your surroundings was a form of respect, both for yourself and for those who came before you. The refrigerator held only condiments and a few canned goods, nothing that required disposal. Samuel had been meticulous about not wasting food, another lesson from his Depression-era upbringing. In the pantry, she found rows of carefully labeled mason jars containing preserved vegetables from his garden. Even in death, Samuel was still providing. Margaret moved to the living room, dusting furniture and organizing the modest collection of books that lined the built-in shelves. Most were what she expected: woodworking manuals, local history, collections of Mark Twain and Robert Frost. But scattered among the familiar titles were volumes that seemed out of place. Books on South American geography, Spanish-language primers, and what appeared to be military tactical manuals. One book particularly caught her attention: Guerrilla Warfare and Asymmetric Conflict. The spine showed significant wear, suggesting frequent consultation. Margaret pulled it from the shelf and found numerous passages highlighted in Samuel's careful script. Margin notes discussed supply lines, communication protocols, and something called compartmentalized operations. Her laptop, plugged in on the kitchen table, had been running searches for Samuel Carter and various combinations of his name with military terms. The results were frustratingly vague. Several Samuel Carters had served in Vietnam, but none matched her grandfather's age or background. Either he'd served under a different name, or his service had been the kind that didn't appear in public records. The afternoon sun was beginning to fade when Margaret decided to tackle Samuel's bedroom. She'd been avoiding it, knowing it would be the most emotionally difficult space to clean. The room held the strongest concentration of Samuel's presence, his reading glasses on the nightstand, work shirts hanging in the closet, the faint scent of the cedar soap he'd always used. She began with the dresser, carefully folding and packing Samuel's clothes for donation. In the bottom drawer, beneath carefully maintained sweaters, her fingers encountered something unexpected. The wooden bottom of the drawer felt loose, moving slightly under pressure. Margaret pressed one corner, and the opposite corner popped up, revealing a false bottom. Inside the hidden compartment lay a small collection of military medals, each in its original presentation case. Margaret lifted them out with trembling hands, reading the inscriptions with growing amazement. A Purple Heart, awarded for wounds received in combat. A Bronze Star for meritorious service. A Silver Star for gallantry in action. And finally, a medal she didn't recognize, with no identifying inscription except a serial number. The citation papers accompanying the medals told a story Margaret could barely comprehend. Staff Sergeant Samuel Carter, 5th Special Forces Group, had served 3 tours in Southeast Asia between 1967 and 1972. The descriptions of his actions read like something from a movie. Deep reconnaissance missions behind enemy lines, successful extraction of captured personnel, coordination of indigenous resistance networks, but it was the dates that truly shocked her. According to these records, Samuel had been overseas during the exact period when he'd supposedly been courting her grandmother Rose back in West Virginia. Margaret had heard the story countless times, how Samuel had worked at the local sawmill, how he'd built Rose a hope chest with his own hands, how they'd married in a simple ceremony at the town church. Either the military records were wrong, or the family history she'd grown up believing was entirely fabricated. Margaret sat on Samuel's bed, holding the medals and trying to process the implications. If Samuel had been in Vietnam when he was supposed to be in West Virginia, then what else about his life had been a carefully constructed lie? The final medal case contained something else, a small key taped to the inside lid. Margaret examined it carefully. The key was old, but well maintained, with teeth suggesting it opened a high-quality lock. No identifying marks indicated what it might open, but its placement among Samuel's most secret possessions suggested significant importance. Margaret gathered the medals and their papers, her mind reeling with questions. Jake Morrison's call earlier suddenly seemed less coincidental and more urgent. If Samuel had been involved in activities that required this level of secrecy, then perhaps his neighbor knew more than he'd indicated on the phone. As evening settled over the mountains, Margaret realized her simple cabin cleanup had become something far more complex and potentially dangerous. The discovery of Samuel's military medals had shaken Margaret's understanding of her family history so profoundly that she found herself wandering the cabin aimlessly, unable to focus on any single task. The comfortable narrative of her childhood had begun to crumble, replaced by uncomfortable questions about deception and hidden lives. She made herself a cup of tea using Samuel's old kettle, seeking comfort in familiar rituals. The kitchen window overlooked the garden, where Samuel had grown vegetables and herbs, now overgrown with weeds and volunteer plants. Even in neglect, the space retained the orderly structure he'd imposed. Raised beds and trellises still marking where tomatoes and beans had flourished under his careful attention. Margaret had always admired Samuel's ability to make things grow. As a child, she'd watched him coax life from seemingly barren soil, transforming the Rocky Mountain terrain into productive garden space through patience and understanding. He'd taught her that good gardening was about working with natural systems rather than against them, about observing and responding rather than forcing outcomes. Those lessons had served her well in her consulting work, where she specialized in organizational development and change management. She'd built a successful practice by applying Samuel's philosophy to corporate environments, helping companies transform their cultures. Through careful observation and gradual adjustment, rather than dramatic upheaval, but now she wondered if Samuel's Teachings had been preparation for something more significant than business consulting. Had he been training her to think strategically, to observe carefully, to work within systems while pursuing hidden objectives? The possibility that even his most innocent lessons might have carried covert purposes left her feeling manipulated and confused. The living room bookshelves drew her attention again. She'd noticed the out-of-place military and geographical texts earlier, but now she examined the arrangement more carefully. Samuel had always been methodical about organization, grouping books by subject and maintaining careful order. It struck her as odd that the unusual books were scattered randomly among his normal reading material rather than grouped together. Margaret began removing books systematically, looking for patterns or hidden meaning in their placement. Behind a collection of poetry volumes, her fingers encountered empty space where she expected more books. Pulling the poetry books forward revealed a gap in the shelf, as if several volumes had been removed to make room for something else. Reaching into the gap, she felt the smooth metal surface of some kind of equipment. Margaret worked carefully to extract the device, which proved to be heavier than expected. When she finally maneuvered it free, she found herself holding a vintage, reel-to-reel tape recorder, the kind used for professional audio recording in the 1960s and 70s. The machine was in excellent condition, despite its apparent age, suggesting Samuel had maintained it with the same care he applied to his woodworking tools. A power cord was wrapped neatly around the base, and a small collection of tape reels sat in a wooden box beside where the recorder had been hidden. Margaret carried the device to Samuel's reading chair and plugged it into the nearby outlet. The machine hummed to life with the distinctive sound of vintage electronics warming up. She selected one of the tape reels at random and threaded it onto the machine, according to faded instructions printed on the device's housing. When she pressed play, Samuel's voice filled the room with startling clarity. But this wasn't the gentle grandfather she remembered. The voice was harder, more focused, speaking in the clipped cadence of someone accustomed to giving orders under pressure. Operation Debrief. Date November 15th, 1971. Mission. Designation Broken Arrow 7. Successful extraction of 3. Personnel from grid coordinates. Samuel's voice recited a series of numbers and military terminology. That meant nothing to Margaret, but carried the weight of life and death. Decisions. She listened, transfixed, as her grandfather described coordinating helicopter insertions, managing communication protocols, and directing what sounded like combat operations. The Samuel on the recording was confident and commanding, making strategic decisions with the calm authority of someone who'd done this countless times before. Margaret fast-forwarded through portions of the recording, finding similar entries spanning what appeared to be months or years of operations. Each entry was professional and methodical, but occasionally Samuel's voice carried undertones of emotion when discussing casualties or mission complications. One particular entry caught her attention. Personal note regarding extraction protocols. The families never know the real cost. They see the successful missions, the people who make it to safety, but they don't understand what we sacrifice to make that possible. Elena keeps asking when I can come home permanently. How do I explain that home is wherever the next mission requires me to be? Margaret stopped the tape, her heart racing. Elena, the same name from the letters she'd found in the hidden chest. This wasn't just some random operation Samuel had been involved in. This was personal, connected to a relationship that apparently meant everything to him. Margaret rewound the tape and played Samuel's mention of Elena again, her grandfather's voice carrying a tenderness she'd never heard before. The contrast between his professional military tone and the softness. When he spoke Elena's name, revealed depths of emotion that challenged everything she thought she knew about his character. She returned to the bedroom where she'd first discovered the hidden chest, determined to examine the letters more carefully. The ribbon that bound them was silk, faded from deep red to dusty rose with age. Margaret untied it gently, treating the letters with the reverence they seemed to deserve based on Samuel's obvious care in preserving them. The paper was expensive stationery, cream-colored with a subtle watermark visible when held to the light. Elena's handwriting was elegant and precise, suggesting education and refinement. The earliest letter was dated 1969, written in a mixture of English and Spanish that spoke of cultural complexity Margaret hadn't expected. Mi querido Samuel, the first letter began. I know the danger of writing to you, but I cannot bear the silence any longer. 3 months have passed since you left Bogota, and every day I wonder if you are safe, if the mission has been successful, if you remember the promises we made under the stars in the mountains. Margaret read slowly, her Spanish rusty from college courses, but adequate to understand the passionate declarations of love and concern. Elena wrote about waiting for news, about the constant fear that Samuel might not return from whatever dangerous work he was doing. The letters painted a picture of a woman deeply in love but forced to live with uncertainty and separation. As Margaret progressed through the correspondence, spanning decades, she began to understand the scope of Samuel and Elena's relationship. This wasn't a brief wartime romance, but a sustained love affair that had somehow survived years of separation and secrecy. Elena's later letters, written in the 1980s and 90s, referenced our work, suggesting she wasn't merely waiting passively for Samuel's return, but was actively involved in whatever operations he conducted. One letter from 1987 particularly struck Margaret. The children arrived safely at the mountain station. 12 this time, all under the age of 10. I cannot describe the relief in their eyes when they realized they were truly safe. Your contact in Guatemala performed exactly as promised. These little ones will have new lives now, new names, families who will love them despite not sharing their blood. This is why we do this work, mi amor. This is why the sacrifice and separation matter. Margaret set the letter down, her hands trembling slightly. Children. Elena and Samuel had been involved in moving children to safety, apparently from dangerous situations in Central and South America. The military medals suddenly made more sense, as did the coded entries in Samuel's workshop journal. They hadn't been running some criminal enterprise. They'd been saving lives, but the personal cost was evident in every letter. Elena wrote frequently about loneliness, about missing Samuel during holidays and celebrations, about the difficulty of maintaining their relationship when they could rarely be together openly. Samuel's responses, written in his careful script, echoed her pain while expressing unwavering commitment to both their love and their mission. A letter from 1995 revealed that their separation wasn't entirely voluntary. The threats against your granddaughter have increased. My contacts in Medellin report that Carlos Vega has specifically mentioned Margaret as leverage against you. We cannot risk any connection between us while she is in danger. I know how much it costs you to maintain distance, but her safety must come first. Margaret's blood ran cold. Someone named Carlos Vega had threatened her personally, apparently as a way to control Samuel's actions. The realization that her grandfather had been protecting her from threats she'd never known existed left her feeling both grateful and terrified. How many other dangers had Samuel quietly deflected throughout her life? The most recent letter was dated just 6 months before Samuel's death. The network is compromised. Too many people know about the mountain routes, about the cabin. I fear our time is running out, mi amor. If something happens to me, remember that everything we've built must continue. The children still need safe passage, and there are others ready to take up the work. Look for the eagle when the time comes. Margaret read the final lines several times, trying to understand their meaning. What eagle? What network? And most importantly, what did Elena mean by others ready to take up the work? A sound outside made Margaret freeze. Through the bedroom window, she could see a dark sedan parked at the edge of the tree line, barely visible in the gathering dusk. Someone was watching the cabin, and based on Elena's warnings about threats and compromised networks, Margaret suspected their intentions weren't friendly. She carefully gathered the letters and moved away from the window, her heart racing as the full implications of her discoveries began to sink in. Margaret kept the lights off as she moved through the cabin, using the fading daylight to navigate while staying away from windows. The dark sedan remained positioned at the tree line, its occupants invisible behind tinted glass, but their presence a constant reminder that Samuel's secret world was more dangerous than she'd imagined. She needed to understand more about what she'd inherited along with the cabin. Elena's letters had revealed the humanitarian nature of their work, but they'd also made clear that powerful people opposed their operations. If someone was watching the cabin, Margaret needed to know exactly what they might be looking for. In the living room, she examined the stone fireplace more carefully. Samuel had built it himself during the cabin's construction, using river rocks gathered from the mountain streams. As a child, Margaret had helped him sort stones by size and color, learning to appreciate the natural variations that would create an attractive pattern when assembled. Now she noticed something she'd missed during casual observation. Several stones near the hearth's base looked subtly different from the others, their surfaces slightly smoother and their placement more deliberate. When she pressed against them experimentally, one shifted under pressure, revealing itself to be a carefully crafted facade rather than a solid stone. Behind the false stone was a shallow cavity containing a leather portfolio tied with string. Margaret extracted it carefully, noting the weight suggested substantial contents. She carried it to Samuel's reading chair and used a small flashlight from her purse to examine what she'd found. The portfolio contained dozens of photographs, spanning what appeared to be several decades. The earliest images, in black and white, showed a younger Samuel in military fatigues standing beside helicopters and posing with groups of serious-looking men in jungle settings. His face carried the lean intensity of someone living under constant stress, but his eyes showed the same kindness Margaret remembered from childhood. As she progressed through the chronological arrangement, the photographs transitioned to color and began including a woman Margaret immediately recognized from the chess set's careful carving. Elena was stunning, with dark hair and expressive eyes that seemed to hold both warmth and steel. Early photos showed her in what appeared to be medical settings, wearing white coats and standing beside hospital equipment, but the most shocking discovery came in photographs from the 1980s and 90s. Margaret found herself staring at images of her own childhood that she'd never seen before. There was 5-year-old Margaret helping Samuel in his workshop, but Elena was visible in the background, watching from the kitchen doorway. Another photo showed Margaret's 8th birthday party, with Elena serving cake while carefully staying out of the main group. Elena had been present throughout Margaret's childhood, hidden in plain sight, while Margaret remained completely unaware of her existence. Samuel had somehow managed to maintain his relationship with Elena while keeping her invisible to his granddaughter. The logistics of such deception suggested careful planning and disciplined execution that spoke to Samuel's operational training. More disturbing were photographs that appeared to document rescue operations. Images of small groups crossing mountain terrain at night, children being transferred between vehicles, and what looked like temporary camps hidden in remote locations. Margaret recognized some of the landscapes as being near the cabin, suggesting Samuel had used the property as part of whatever network he and Elena operated. One photograph made Margaret's hands shake. It showed a man she didn't recognize standing beside a black SUV, but his posture and expression radiated menace. Someone had written CV Medellin 1994 on the back in Samuel's handwriting. Carlos Vega, the man Elena had mentioned as making threats against Margaret. Seeing his face made the danger feel immediate and personal rather than abstract. The final photographs in the collection were recent, some apparently taken just months before Samuel's death. They showed Elena looking older but still vibrant, standing beside what appeared to be a small aircraft on a remote airstrip. Her expression was tense, and she seemed to be scanning the horizon as if watching for threats. Several photos depicted what looked like a cave system or underground facility, with Elena and other individuals moving supplies and equipment through stone passages. Margaret couldn't identify the location, but the photos suggested Elena's operations had grown more sophisticated and hidden over the years. As Margaret studied the images, she began to understand the scope of what Samuel and Elena had built. This wasn't just a romantic relationship complicated by external circumstances. They'd created an entire clandestine network dedicated to rescuing people, primarily children, from dangerous situations throughout Central and South America. The sound of a car door slamming outside made Margaret freeze. Through a gap in the curtains, she could see the dark sedan had moved closer to the cabin, now parked in the main driveway. Two figures emerged from the vehicle, their movements deliberate and coordinated in a way that suggested professional training. Margaret gathered the photographs quickly, her mind racing through options for escape or concealment. Margaret's heart pounded as she heard footsteps on the gravel driveway. She quickly extinguished the flashlight and moved away from the windows, clutching the photographs against her chest. The footsteps circled the cabin slowly, deliberately, as if the visitors were conducting reconnaissance rather than planning an immediate confrontation. After several tense minutes, she heard car doors slam again and the sound of the sedan driving away. Margaret waited another hour before turning on any lights, using the time to think through what she'd learned and what it might mean for her safety. Clearly, Samuel's death hadn't ended whatever conflict he'd been involved in. When she finally felt secure enough to resume her investigation, Margaret returned to the workshop with new purpose. If Samuel had maintained an active role in rescue operations until his death, he must have had ways to communicate with Elena and other network members. The coded entries in his journal suggested ongoing coordination of activities, but she hadn't yet found the communication equipment that would make such coordination possible. She began a more systematic search of the workshop, looking for hidden compartments or concealed equipment. Samuel's organizational skills meant that important items would be stored logically, but not obviously. Margaret focused on areas that seemed inconsistent with the workshop's primary function. Behind Samuel's collection of woodworking plans, she found a section of wall paneling that seemed slightly different from the rest. The wood grain didn't quite match, and gentle pressure revealed it was actually a hinged panel rather than a fixed wall section. Inside the hidden compartment was equipment that looked like it belonged in a spy movie rather than a mountain cabin. The device appeared to be a modified ham radio, but with additional components and modifications that suggested capabilities beyond normal amateur radio operation. Multiple antennas were connected through the wall to external mounting points Margaret hadn't noticed from outside. A logbook beside the radio contained entries in the same coded format she'd seen in Samuel's workshop journal. Margaret had some experience with electronics from college engineering courses, enough to recognize sophisticated equipment when she saw it. This wasn't hobbyist gear. It was professional communication equipment designed for secure, long-range contact with multiple parties. The modifications suggested Samuel had been part of a network that required encrypted communication and operational security. She powered up the device carefully, noting that it hummed to life immediately, suggesting regular maintenance and use. A digital display showed multiple frequency settings, and as Margaret experimented with the controls, she began receiving transmissions. Most were in Spanish, but she caught enough English phrases to understand these were operational communications. "Package confirmed for mountain crossing tomorrow night," came one transmission. "Weather conditions favorable, Route 7 remains secure." Another voice responded with coordinates and timing details. Margaret realized she was listening to active rescue operations. Possibly the same network Samuel and Elena had built over decades of dangerous work. Her laptop research had yielded frustratingly little information about Samuel's official background. but cross-referencing the names and locations mentioned in Elena's letters provided more context. Carlos Vega appeared in news articles about drug cartel activities in Colombia during the 1990s, described as a ruthless enforcer who disappeared from public view after several high-profile arrests of his associates. The rescue operations Elena had described made more sense when Margaret researched the political situations in Central and South America during the relevant time periods. Civil wars, drug violence, and political persecution had created millions of refugees, particularly children who'd lost parents to violence or been targeted themselves for various reasons. Samuel and Elena's network appeared to have focused specifically on extracting children from dangerous situations and relocating them to safety, often in the United States. The logistics of such operations would require extensive planning, reliable contacts, and secure communication systems, exactly like what Margaret had discovered. A new transmission caught her attention. Mountain base compromised. Recommend immediate extraction of all materials. Elena requests confirmation of Eagle status. Margaret's pulse quickened at the mention of Elena's name and the Eagle reference from the final letter. Someone was actively monitoring Samuel's cabin and the surrounding area. She quickly wrote down the frequency and timing of the transmission, hoping to establish communication with Elena or other network members. But the conversation that followed made clear the situation was deteriorating rapidly. References to hostile surveillance and compromised routes suggested that whoever had been watching the cabin was part of a larger operation aimed at dismantling the rescue network. Margaret realized that inheriting Samuel's cabin meant inheriting his enemies as well. The dark sedan from earlier was probably just the beginning. If she wanted to survive long enough to understand her grandfather's legacy, she needed help from people who understood the danger she was facing. The radio crackled with another transmission. New contact at Mountain Base. Proceed with caution until identity confirmed. Margaret stared at the device, realizing they were talking about her. Margaret spent the night monitoring radio transmissions and researching everything she could find about the names and locations mentioned in the communications. By dawn, she had a clearer picture of the network Samuel and Elena had built, but also a growing sense of the dangers they faced from multiple directions. The rescue operations were more extensive than she'd initially understood. References to routes through Mexico, Guatemala, Colombia, and other Central American countries suggested a sophisticated system for moving people from danger zones to safety. The network included safe houses, transportation coordinators, document specialists, and medical support personnel scattered across thousands of miles. But the radio chatter also revealed that the network was under systematic attack. Several safe houses had been compromised, key personnel had gone missing, and the routes Samuel had spent decades establishing were being monitored by hostile forces. Elena's requests for Eagle status apparently referred to some kind of emergency protocol that would preserve the most critical elements of the operation. Margaret's attempt to research Jake Morrison, her expected visitor, had yielded mixed results. Public records showed he'd lived in the area for 15 years, owned a small construction business, and had no criminal history. But the timing of his call, immediately after her arrival at the cabin, suggested his interest wasn't purely neighborly. She decided to prepare for his visit by learning more about Samuel's security arrangements. If her grandfather had been involved in operations dangerous enough to require encrypted communications and constant vigilance, he must have taken precautions to protect himself and the cabin. Margaret began examining the cabin's construction more carefully, looking for defensive features or hidden escape routes. The building's placement on the mountainside provided excellent visibility of approaching vehicles, and several windows offered clear fields of fire in multiple directions. What she'd always assumed was Samuel's preference for mountain views might have been strategic positioning. In the bedroom where she'd found the military medals, Margaret noticed something odd about the closet's proportions. The interior space seemed smaller than the room's dimensions would suggest, as if part of the area had been walled off. She tapped along the back wall until she found a section that sounded hollow. Pressing against the hollow area revealed another hidden panel, this one concealing a space large enough to store substantial equipment. Inside was a military-style duffel bag, packed and ready as if Samuel had been prepared to leave immediately if circumstances required. The bag's contents revealed the depth of Samuel's operational preparedness. Multiple sets of identification documents bore his photograph, but different names and backgrounds. Stacks of cash in various currencies totaled more than Margaret earned in a year. Maps showed routes through wilderness areas that would allow movement without using main roads or populated areas. Most disturbing was the weapons cache: a compact assault rifle, 2 handguns, and enough ammunition to sustain extended combat. Margaret had never known Samuel to own firearms beyond an old hunting rifle he'd used for pest control around the garden. The presence of military-grade weapons suggested he'd anticipated serious threats requiring lethal response. Documentation in the bag included contact information for people and organizations Margaret didn't recognize, emergency protocols for various scenarios, and detailed plans for evacuating the cabin under different threat conditions. Everything was organized with military precision and suggested constant readiness for immediate departure. One document particularly caught her attention: a letter addressed to MC in Samuel's handwriting. Margaret opened it carefully, realizing it had been written specifically for her to find in exactly these circumstances. "Margaret," the letter began, "if you're reading this, then something has happened to me, and you've begun discovering the truth about my life. I know this must be overwhelming and confusing, but everything I did was to protect you and to save innocent people who had no other hope." The letter continued with explanations of the rescue network, Elena's role, and the threats they faced from criminal organizations who profited from the chaos and violence in Central and South America. Samuel acknowledged that he'd deceived Margaret about fundamental aspects of his identity, but insisted that every lie had been necessary to keep her safe from people who would use her as leverage against him. "The work must continue," Samuel wrote. "Too many children depend on the routes we've established, and Elena cannot maintain the network alone. I've spent your entire life preparing you for this moment, though I hoped it would never come. Your analytical skills, your ability to solve complex problems, your understanding of systems and logistics, all of this was training for the choice you now face," the letter concluded, with specific instructions for contacting Elena safely and detailed explanations of the cabin's defensive features. Samuel had prepared Margaret for a war she'd never known existed, and now she had to decide whether to flee from that inheritance or embrace it. A knock at the front door interrupted her reading. Through the window, she could see Jake Morrison standing on the porch. But he wasn't alone. Margaret peered through the curtains and saw Jake Morrison standing beside a woman who appeared to be in her 60s, with graying hair and the weathered face of someone accustomed to outdoor work. Both visitors maintained relaxed postures, but Margaret noticed how they positioned themselves to watch both the cabin and the surrounding tree line simultaneously. She decided to answer the door, but kept Samuel's letter and the go-bag contents within easy reach. If Jake Morrison was part of Samuel's network, he might be able to provide answers. If he represented a threat, she needed to learn that as quickly as possible. "Margaret," Jake called through the door, "I brought someone I think you should meet. Her name is Maria Santos, and she worked with your grandfather." Margaret opened the door cautiously, keeping the chain latch engaged. Jake appeared to be in his 50s, with the solid build of someone who'd spent years in physical labor. His eyes held an alertness that reminded her of Samuel's careful way of observing everything around him. Maria Santos was smaller than she'd appeared through the window, but her presence commanded immediate respect. When she spoke, her accent revealed Spanish as a first language, though her English was precise and educated. "Samuel told me about you many times," Maria said. "He was very proud of your accomplishments, but also very worried about the day when you might need to know the truth about his work." Margaret unlatched the door and stepped back to allow them inside. Jake immediately moved to close the curtains, while Maria examined the room with the systematic attention of someone checking for threats or surveillance equipment. "We monitored radio transmissions last night," Jake explained. "Someone was attempting to triangulate the source of communications from this location. That means hostile forces know Samuel's equipment is still active and probably suspect you've discovered his materials." Maria nodded grimly. "Carlos Vega's organization has been systematically destroying our network for the past year. They've identified most of our safe houses and eliminated several key personnel. Samuel's death wasn't natural. They poisoned him to prevent him from relocating the mountain operations before they could be compromised." The revelation that Samuel had been murdered hit Margaret like a physical blow. She'd attended his funeral believing he'd died peacefully of heart failure, but the truth was far more sinister. Her grandfather had been killed by people who wanted to destroy his humanitarian work. "We have perhaps 12 hours before Vega's people mount a full assault on this location," Maria continued. "They know Samuel had extensive documentation and communication equipment here. They want to capture everything before we can evacuate it." Margaret led them to the workshop, where she showed them Samuel's hidden radio equipment and the various artifacts she'd discovered. Maria examined each item with recognition and growing concern. "Samuel documented everything," Maria observed. "This is both valuable and dangerous. The information here could resurrect our entire network, but in the wrong hands. It would allow Vega to eliminate everyone we've ever helped." Jake was examining Samuel's workshop journal when he called their attention to something Margaret had missed. "Look at this," he said, pointing to seemingly random marks scattered throughout the journal's pages. "These aren't just decorative elements, they're reference markers." Following Jake's observation, Margaret noticed that many pages contained small symbols that seemed unrelated to the woodworking notes. Stars, crosses, and tiny arrows appeared at irregular intervals throughout the journal. Maria studied the symbols with growing excitement. "It's a reference system," she explained. "Samuel always kept backup documentation hidden separately from his primary records. These symbols probably indicate corresponding information stored somewhere else." Margaret remembered the religious books she'd seen among Samuel's collection. Many people used Bibles for personal note-taking, and Samuel had been raised in a religious household. She retrieved a Spanish-language Bible from the living room shelf, noting it showed significant wear. Despite Samuel's limited Spanish skills, Maria took the Bible and began examining it under the workshop's bright lighting. "Heat," she said suddenly. "Some inks become visible when heated." She held pages near the workshop's electric heater, and faint writing began to appear between the printed verses. The hidden text revealed itself as an extensive coding system. Names, locations, and operational details had been written in invisible ink throughout the religious text. Maria translated the Spanish portions, while Margaret noted the English entries. Together, they revealed a comprehensive record of the rescue network's operations spanning more than 30 years. "This is extraordinary," Maria whispered. "Samuel documented every person we helped, every route we used, every contact who provided assistance. With this information, we could rebuild the entire network, but the Bible contained disturbing recent entries as well. References to network penetration and systematic elimination confirmed that their operations had been thoroughly compromised. Samuel's final entries, dated just weeks before his death, detailed plans for preserving critical elements of the network through a succession protocol centered on Margaret's inheritance of the cabin. As Margaret absorbed the reality of Samuel's murder and the systematic destruction of his network, Jake moved to the workshop window and peered through a gap in the curtains. His expression grew tense as he observed something in the distance. "We have company," he announced quietly. Two vehicles positioned on the ridge road, probably conducting surveillance. "They're maintaining distance, but watching the access routes to the cabin." Maria immediately began gathering the most critical documents from Samuel's hidden materials. "We need to evacuate the essential information before they move closer." "Jake, how long do we have?" "Depends on their orders," Jake replied. "If they're waiting for darkness, maybe 6 hours. If they're planning immediate action, much less." Margaret watched them work with professional efficiency and realized she was seeing people who'd spent years living with constant danger. Their calm competence in the face of threat suggested extensive experience with similar situations. "Jake," she said, "you knew about Samuel's work all along, didn't you?" He paused in his security observations and nodded. "For about 10 years. Samuel recruited me after I got out of the army. I'd done 2 tours in Afghanistan and was having trouble adjusting to civilian life. He offered me purpose and a way to use my skills for something that mattered." Jake moved to a storage cabinet Margaret hadn't explored and retrieved a large manila folder. "I've been documenting Samuel's impact on this community for years. People don't realize how many lives he saved right here in these mountains." The folder contained newspaper clippings spanning 2 decades, collected from local papers throughout the Appalachian region. Jake spread them across Samuel's workbench, revealing a pattern Margaret had never noticed. "Missing persons cases," Jake explained, pointing to headlines from various newspapers. "Always the same profile. Children or young adults who disappeared from dangerous family situations, often involving domestic violence or drug-related activity." Margaret examined the clippings more carefully. The missing persons were typically described as runaways or potential kidnapping victims, but follow-up articles told a different story. Most were eventually found safe in distant locations, placed with new families or in protective programs. Samuel coordinated with social services, law enforcement, and family court systems, Jake continued. When legal protections failed and children remained in danger, he provided alternative solutions. The official system couldn't save everyone, but Samuel could. One particular series of articles caught Margaret's attention. A 12-year-old girl named Lucy Patterson had disappeared from her home near Charleston after her stepfather was arrested for drug trafficking. The initial report suggested kidnapping by her father's criminal associates, but 6 months later, a follow-up story reported she'd been found safe with distant relatives in Oregon. "Lucy Patterson is now Dr. Lucia Santos," Maria interjected. "She's a pediatric surgeon in Portland and has no idea Samuel saved her life." "That's true for most of the people we helped. They never knew the real story behind their rescue." Jake showed Margaret more clippings revealing similar patterns throughout the region. Samuel had apparently maintained a network of contacts within social services, law enforcement, and the court system, who identified cases where children couldn't be protected through legal channels. The local operations were just one part of Samuel's work, Jake explained. The international rescues with Eleanor were more dangerous and complex. But he never stopped helping people right here in his own backyard. Margaret began to understand the scope of her grandfather's humanitarian efforts. He hadn't been some distant operative working only in foreign countries. He'd been actively protecting vulnerable people in his own community for decades. "How many people knew about this?" she asked. "Very few," Maria replied. Samuel compartmentalized information carefully. "I knew about the international network, but not the local operations. Jake knew about the local work, but not all the international connections. Only Samuel saw the complete picture." Jake gathered the newspaper clippings and returned them to the folder. "The local network is still active, but we lost our coordination center when Samuel died. Several children are currently in dangerous situations that we haven't been able to address without his contacts and resources." The weight of responsibility began settling on Margaret's shoulders. Samuel's work hadn't ended with his death. It had simply been interrupted. People were still in danger, still needed help, still depended on the network he'd spent his life building. "There's something else you need to see," Jake said, moving to another cabinet. Samuel left specific instructions about what to do if something happened to him. He was planning for succession long before his death. Margaret realized her grandfather had been preparing her not just to discover his secret life, but to inherit the responsibility for continuing it. Jake retrieved a flat wooden case from beneath Samuel's workbench, its surface worn smooth from years of handling. The case was secured with a combination lock, but Jake seemed to know the numbers by heart. Inside, protected by oiled cloth, were dozens of hand-drawn maps executed with the precision of a professional cartographer. Samuel spent 40 years perfecting these routes, Jake explained, carefully unfolding the first map. Every trail, every shelter, every water source between here and the Mexican border. He knew these mountains better than anyone alive. Margaret studied the intricate drawings, marveling at the detail and accuracy. The maps showed not just topographical features, but also marked safe houses, supply caches, observation posts, and alternative routes around populated areas. Each drawing was annotated with notes about seasonal conditions, potential hazards, and timing considerations for moving people safely through wilderness areas. "This is how we moved people without detection," Maria added, pointing to a series of connected routes that wound through national forest land and private properties. Samuel negotiated agreements with dozens of landowners who were willing to allow passage in exchange for various services. Many didn't know they were helping rescue operations, but they trusted Samuel enough to cooperate. The maps revealed an underground railroad system that stretched across multiple states, with the Appalachian cabin serving as a critical way station. Routes from the south brought people fleeing violence in Central America, while northern routes provided paths toward Canada for those seeking asylum. Everything converged in the mountains around Samuel's property. Margaret traced one particular route with her finger, following a path that led from the cabin through wilderness areas toward what appeared to be a small airstrip marked on a neighboring mountain. Samuel had access to aircraft? Limited, Jake replied. Elena coordinated air transport for the most critical cases, but usually we moved people overland. Safer and less detectable, though much slower. The sophistication of the network impressed and intimidated Margaret. Samuel hadn't been running some amateur operation. He'd created a professional smuggling system that rivaled anything operated by criminal organizations. The difference was that his network saved lives instead of destroying them. "Look at this," Maria said, pointing to recent additions to several maps. Samuel was updating routes as late as last month. He knew his time was running out, but was still improving the system. The newest annotations showed alternative routes around areas marked as compromised or hostile. Surveillance. Samuel had been adapting to the systematic destruction of his network, finding new ways to maintain operations despite increasing pressure from Carlos Vega's organization. One map particularly caught Margaret's attention. It showed detailed plans for a route that began at the cabin but didn't follow any of the established paths. Instead, it led through some of the most challenging terrain in the region, ending at what appeared to be a cave system marked with the symbol of an eagle. "The Eagle Protocol," Jake explained when Margaret asked about the unusual route. Samuel's final contingency plan. If everything else failed, if the entire network was compromised, this route would allow critical personnel and information to reach a secure location where operations could be rebuilt. Margaret studied the Eagle route more carefully, noting the extreme difficulty of the terrain and the specific equipment requirements listed in Samuel's annotations. This wasn't a path for casual hikers. It required mountain climbing skills, cold weather gear, and several days of difficult travel through wilderness areas. Eleanor's last message mentioned the eagle, Margaret recalled. She was asking about its status. Maria and Jake exchanged glances that suggested the Eagle Protocol represented more than just an escape route. "Samuel never told us the exact location of the Eagle site," Maria admitted. "He said it was information that only family should know. something to be passed down through generations if the network ever needed to be completely reconstructed. The implication was clear. Samuel had prepared Margaret not just to inherit his work, but to serve as the final guardian of everything he'd built. The Eagle Protocol was her responsibility now, along with the knowledge of how to rebuild the entire rescue network if circumstances required it. Jake pointed to movement outside the workshop window. "We have more immediate concerns. The surveillance vehicles have moved closer, and I can see personnel moving through the tree line. They're preparing for an assault." Margaret looked at the maps spread across the workbench, representing decades of Samuel's work and hundreds of lives saved through careful planning and courageous execution. In a few hours, hostile forces would attempt to capture or destroy everything Samuel had spent his life building. "How long would it take to reach the Eagle site?" she asked. "Through that terrain carrying essential materials, probably 18 hours of hard travel," Jake replied. "But Margaret, you don't understand what you'd be committing to. Once you activate the Eagle Protocol, there's no going back to your normal life." As Jake continued monitoring the approaching hostile forces, Margaret made a decision that surprised even herself. She wasn't ready to abandon Samuel's legacy or flee from responsibilities she was only beginning to understand. But first, she needed to know exactly what she was committing to defend. "Show me everything," she told Maria. "If I'm going to make an informed choice about the Eagle Protocol, I need to understand the complete scope of what Samuel was protecting." Maria nodded approvingly and led Margaret to a filing cabinet she hadn't noticed before, concealed behind what appeared to be a solid workshop wall panel. Inside were dozens of folders organized by date and operation code. Maria selected the most recent file, labeled Current Threat Assessment 2024. The documents inside painted a disturbing picture of systematic violence against humanitarian networks throughout Central and South America. Carlos Vega's organization had evolved from a traditional drug cartel into something more sophisticated and dangerous, a criminal enterprise that profited from human trafficking, refugee exploitation, and the deliberate destabilization of rescue operations. Vega discovered that rescued children couldn't be used as leverage against their families. Maria explained as Margaret read through intelligence reports. So he began targeting the rescuers instead. If he could eliminate the networks that moved people to safety, families would have no choice but to pay his organization for protection. The threat assessment included detailed profiles of network members who had been killed or disappeared over the past year. Margaret recognized some names from Elena's letters and Samuel's coded journal entries. These weren't abstract casualties. They were people Samuel had worked with for decades, friends who'd been murdered for their humanitarian efforts. One section of the report focused specifically on threats against Margaret herself. Surveillance reports documented her daily routines in Charleston, her work schedule, her failed marriage to David, even her weekend hiking trips in the nearby state parks. Vega's organization had been watching her for months before Samuel's death. "They planned to use you as leverage against Samuel," Maria continued. "When he died before they could execute their plan, they shifted strategy. Now they want to use you to draw Elena out of hiding." Margaret found photographs of herself taken without her knowledge, leaving her apartment, meeting clients, shopping for groceries. The invasion of privacy was disturbing, but more frightening was the realization that armed criminals had been close enough to harm her whenever they chose. "Elena is the primary target," Jake said from his position at the window. "She coordinated the South American operations and knows the identities of hundreds of people throughout the network. If Vega captures her, he can eliminate everyone who ever helped rescue operations." The threat assessment's final section outlined Samuel's analysis of Vega's ultimate objective. Beyond simply destroying the rescue network, he wanted to control migration routes throughout the region. By eliminating humanitarian alternatives, he could force desperate families to use his trafficking services or face impossible choices about their children's Safety. Samuel estimated that Vega's success would result in thousands of additional children being trapped in dangerous situations, Maria explained. Not just in South America, but here in the United States as well. The local networks we maintain are part of a larger system that protects vulnerable people everywhere. Margaret studied intelligence photographs of Vega himself, noting the cold calculation in his eyes and the expensive clothes that suggested substantial wealth. This wasn't some desperate criminal driven by circumstances. He was a successful businessman who happened to profit from human misery. The report included a detailed timeline of recent attacks against the network. Safe houses had been raided, contact points had been compromised, and key personnel had been eliminated with professional efficiency. Vega's organization employed former military and intelligence operatives who understood how to dismantle clandestine networks systematically. Samuel knew they were closing in, Jake observed, still watching the tree line for signs of movement. The threat assessment's final entry is dated just 3 days before his death. He was preparing for the worst-case scenario. Margaret found Samuel's final analysis in his own handwriting. Network integrity compromised beyond repair. Traditional operations no longer sustainable. Eagle Protocol represents only viable option for preserving core mission. Succession planning critical for long-term survival of humanitarian objectives. The documents made clear that Samuel hadn't just been protecting his own life. He'd been fighting to preserve decades of work that had saved thousands of people. His death had been a strategic victory for forces that wanted to eliminate any alternative to exploitation and trafficking. How many people are depending on the network right now? Margaret asked. Maria consulted a separate file. 43 children currently in transit through various routes. Dozens more in safe houses waiting for transport. Several families in immediate danger who've requested extraction. Margaret realized that abandoning Samuel's work wouldn't just mean honoring his memory differently. It would mean abandoning real people facing real dangers. The sound of a vehicle approaching at high speed made Jake tense at the window. "Someone's coming fast," he announced, reaching for a weapon Margaret hadn't noticed him carrying. Single vehicle, moving like they know the terrain. Maria immediately began gathering the most critical documents, preparing for either evacuation or destruction of sensitive materials. Margaret felt her heart racing as she realized the theoretical danger she'd been learning about was about to become very real. But instead of the hostile assault they'd been expecting, the approaching vehicle stopped abruptly in front of the cabin. Jake's expression changed from alarm to recognition as a figure emerged from what appeared to be a battered pickup truck. "It's Elena," he said with obvious relief. "She made it." Margaret watched through the window as an elderly woman approached the cabin with the careful alertness of someone accustomed to danger. Even at a distance, Margaret could see this was the same woman from Samuel's hidden photographs. Though decades older and clearly exhausted from whatever journey had brought her here, Elena knocked on the door with a specific pattern that Jake seemed to recognize as a security signal. When Maria opened the door, the two women embraced with the intensity of people who'd survived considerable danger together. "They found the mountain station," Eleanor said without preamble, her accent more pronounced than Margaret had expected. "3 vehicles, professional team. I had perhaps 10 minutes to evacuate before they arrived." Elena's appearance shocked Margaret. The photographs had shown a confident, vibrant woman involved in important work. The person who entered Samuel's cabin was still alert and capable, but clearly operating under extreme stress and physical exhaustion. "Elena," Maria said gently, "this is Margaret, Samuel's granddaughter." Eleanor turned to study Margaret with eyes that held both warmth and sadness. "You look like your grandmother Rose," she said softly. "Samuel showed me photographs, but the resemblance is even stronger in person." Margaret felt a strange mixture of emotions meeting the woman who'd been central to Samuel's secret life. Elena represented answers to questions she'd been asking, but also the reality of dangers she was only beginning to understand. I know this must be overwhelming, Elena continued, moving closer to Margaret. Samuel spoke of you constantly, worried about you constantly. Everything he did was to protect you from the life he and I had chosen. As Elena removed her jacket, Margaret noticed she wore a distinctive necklace that seemed oddly familiar. The pendant was an ornate locket, clearly antique, with intricate metalwork that suggested considerable age and value. That's beautiful, Margaret commented. Drawn to examine the locket more closely, Eleanor's expression became emotional as she carefully removed the necklace. This has been in my family for 4 generations, she said, opening the locket to reveal tiny photographs inside. My grandmother, my mother, myself, and Margaret stared at the photographs, her understanding of everything shifting dramatically. The 4th image showed a young woman she recognized from family photographs Samuel had kept throughout her childhood. But the woman wasn't Elena. It was Rose, Margaret's supposed grandmother. I don't understand, Margaret said, though part of her was beginning to grasp implications too enormous to accept easily. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears as she took Margaret's hands. Samuel and I were your real grandparents, Minietta. Rose was my sister, younger by 18 months. When you were born and our work became too dangerous, Rose agreed to raise you as her own granddaughter to protect you from our enemies. The revelation hit Margaret like a physical blow. Everything she'd believed about her family history was false. Samuel hadn't been her adoptive grandfather after her parents died. He'd been her actual grandfather, forced to maintain distance to protect her from the dangerous life he and Elena led. Your parents, Elena continued gently, were not killed in a car accident. They were targeted by people who wanted to use them against Samuel and me. We had to make them disappear, create new identities, separate them from you to keep everyone safe. Margaret sank into Samuel's reading chair, struggling to process the complete reconstruction of her family history. Her parents were alive somewhere, living under assumed names. Elena was her real grandmother, not some mysterious woman from Samuel's past. Every story she'd been told about her origins was a carefully constructed lie designed to protect her. The cabin, Elena said, was always meant to be yours. Samuel arranged for you to inherit it because he knew that when the time came, when our enemies finally forced a confrontation, you would need to understand the truth about who you are and what we've been fighting to protect. Margaret looked around the cabin with new eyes, realizing it wasn't just a mountain retreat she'd inherited, but the headquarters of a humanitarian operation her grandparents had built over decades of dangerous work. Margaret stared at Elena, trying to process the magnitude of deception that had shaped her entire life. The woman she'd just met was her biological grandmother. The man who'd raised her had been forced to hide their relationship, and the parents she'd mourned were alive somewhere in the world. Show me, Margaret said, her voice steadier than she felt. I need to see proof of what you're telling me. Elena nodded with understanding and reached into a leather bag she'd carried from her truck. Samuel always said you would demand evidence before accepting anything. He was proud of your analytical mind, even when it complicated our efforts to protect you. From the bag, Elena withdrew a manila envelope sealed with wax. Samuel prepared this years ago, hoping you would never need to see it. But circumstances have forced our hand. Inside the envelope were documents that systematically dismantled every assumption Margaret had held about her origins. Birth certificates showing Samuel Carter and Elena Rodriguez as her grandparents, with her father listed as Miguel Santos Carter and her mother as Carmen Elena Rodriguez Carter. Your parents took combined names when they married, Elena explained. It was part of maintaining cultural connections while building new identities for safety reasons. Margaret studied the birth certificate, noting details that contradicted the family story she'd grown up believing. The document showed she'd been born in a hospital in El Paso, Texas, not the small West Virginia town Samuel had always claimed. Her birth weight and other details matched what she knew, but the location and family information were completely different. The car accident, Margaret said slowly. What really happened? Eleanor's expression darkened with painful memories. Carlos Vega had identified your parents as leverage against Samuel and me. They were followed from a safe house in Albuquerque, and there was an attempt to kidnap them. The accident was staged to allow them to escape while making their enemies believe they had died. Elena produced a second set of documents, death certificates for Miguel and Carmen Santos Carter. Margaret recognized the signatures and official seals, but Elena pointed out subtle indicators that revealed them as sophisticated forgeries. We had contacts within government agencies who specialized in creating new identities for people in witness protection programs, Elena explained. Your parents' deaths were officially recorded while they were relocated to secure locations with new names and backgrounds. Margaret examined the forged death certificates, marveling at the attention to detail that had convinced everyone, including herself, of their authenticity. Where are they now? Safe, Elena replied. But I cannot tell you more without endangering them. Part of their protection depends on you believing they were dead. Even now, knowing the truth puts them at greater risk. The ethical complexity of the situation overwhelmed Margaret. Her grandparents had saved her parents' lives through an elaborate deception that had caused her decades of grief over their supposed deaths. Should she be grateful for their survival or angry about the lies that had shaped her emotional development? Elena produced photographs showing Margaret's parents at various ages, including recent images that proved they were indeed alive and apparently well. In the most recent photo, they stood together beside what appeared to be a small house, with mountains in the background, both looking older but healthy and content. They know about you, Elena continued gently. They receive regular updates about your life, your career, your marriage and divorce. They've been proud observers of your achievements, even though they couldn't be part of your life directly. Margaret studied her parents' faces, searching for resemblances and trying to reconcile these strangers with the idealized memories she'd constructed over years of mourning their loss. Her father's eyes were the same shape as her own, and her mother's smile matched expressions Margaret recognized from looking in mirrors. Samuel's death wasn't natural, Elena said, producing a final document from the envelope. This is the autopsy report from a pathologist who understood what to look for. Samuel was poisoned with a substance designed to mimic heart failure. The medical report confirmed Maria's earlier statement about Samuel being murdered, but seeing the scientific evidence made the reality more concrete and disturbing. Someone had deliberately killed her grandfather to prevent him from protecting the rescue network he'd spent his life building. Vega knew that Samuel's death would eventually bring you to the cabin. Lena continued, he was counting on your curiosity and your attachment to Samuel's memory to lead you into discovering our operations. Then he could use you as bait to draw me out of hiding. Margaret realized that her inheritance of the cabin hadn't been a simple bequest. It had been Samuel's final strategic move in a deadly game of protection and pursuit that was still being played out. The weight of Elena's revelations left Margaret feeling like she was drowning in a sea of reconstructed reality. Everything she'd believed about her life had been carefully orchestrated fiction, designed to protect her from dangers she'd never known existed. But before she could fully process the emotional implications, Jake's urgent voice cut through her thoughts. "We have movement on multiple fronts," he announced from his observation post. "At least 8 personnel taking positions around the cabin. They're not surveillance anymore. This is an assault team." Elena immediately shifted into operational mode, her grief and exhaustion replaced by the focused alertness of someone who'd survived decades of similar threats. "How long do we have?" "Maybe 30 minutes before they're in position," Jake replied. "They're being careful, professional. This isn't some rushed operation." Maria began systematically destroying sensitive documents that couldn't be evacuated, feeding papers into the workshop's small furnace. "Margaret," she said, "you need to make a decision now. Stay and fight with us, or evacuate through the Eagle route while there's still time. Margaret looked around the cabin that had been her childhood refuge, now revealed as the command center for a humanitarian network that had saved thousands of lives. The choice wasn't just about her own safety. It was about whether Samuel's life work would continue or die with this assault. "Before I decide anything," Margaret said, "I need to understand exactly what Samuel was asking of me. There has to be more explanation about the Eagle Protocol." Elena nodded and moved to a cabinet Margaret hadn't seen open before. "Samuel recorded a message for you, to be played only if circumstances became desperate enough to require the Eagle option." From the cabinet, Elena retrieved a small digital video camera, its memory card wrapped in protective material. She connected it to Samuel's laptop, and after a few moments, Samuel's face appeared on the screen. He looked older than in Margaret's last memories of him, but his eyes held the same gentle strength she remembered from childhood. "Margaret," Samuel's recorded voice began, "if you're watching this, then everything I spent your lifetime trying to prevent has come to pass. Elena is in immediate danger. Our network is compromised, and you've been forced to learn truths I hoped you'd never need to." "No," Margaret felt tears building as she heard her grandfather's voice explaining the impossible position circumstances had forced upon her family. On screen, Samuel sat in this same workshop, probably recording his message just weeks before his death. "The Eagle Protocol represents more than an escape route," Samuel continued. "Hidden in the mountain cave system is everything needed to rebuild our entire operation from scratch. Communication equipment, financial resources, contact information for allies throughout multiple countries, and detailed plans for re-establishing rescue routes." The camera angle shifted as Samuel stood and moved to a wall map Margaret now recognized as showing the terrain around the Eagle site. "The location has been prepared over 20 years as our ultimate fallback position. Solar power, water sources, storage facilities, defensive positions. Everything required for a small group to operate independently for extended periods." Samuel's expression grew more serious as he continued his explanation. "But activating the Eagle Protocol means committing to a life of constant danger and sacrifice. You would become the primary target for every criminal organization that profits from human trafficking. There would be no normal life, no safe relationships, no peaceful retirement." Margaret realized her grandfather was describing the same choice he and Eleanor had made decades earlier, when they decided to dedicate their lives to protecting people who had no other hope for survival. "The decision must be yours alone," Samuel said, looking directly into the camera with eyes that seemed to see across time to this exact moment. "I raised you with the skills and knowledge you would need, but I cannot make this choice for you. Walk away and live the safe life I always wanted for you. Stay and accept responsibility for continuing work that saves innocent lives." The recording showed Samuel moving to his workbench and picking up tools that were familiar from Margaret's childhood visits. "If you choose the Eagle Path, remember that you won't be alone. Elena will guide you, Jake and Maria will support you, and there are others throughout the network who will stand with you." Samuel set down his tools and looked directly at the camera again. "Whatever you decide, know that I love you more than life itself, and I'm proud of the strong, intelligent woman you've become. The choice is yours, Minietta." The video ended with Samuel reaching toward the camera, his hand filling the screen, before everything went black. Margaret sat in silence, absorbing her grandfather's final message and the magnitude of the decision he'd placed before her. Outside, the sound of vehicles moving closer made it clear that time for contemplation was running out. Margaret stood in the center of Samuel's workshop, surrounded by the artifacts of his secret life and facing the most important decision she would ever make. Through the windows, she could see armed figures moving through the tree line with military precision, closing in on the cabin where her grandfather had spent decades coordinating humanitarian operations. She walked to the cabinet where Samuel had kept his military medals and removed them from their cases. The Purple Heart, Bronze star and silver star felt heavy in her hands, representing sacrifices Samuel had made long before she was born. But it was the unmarked medal, the one with no official recognition, that captured her attention. "What's this one?" she asked Elena, holding up the mysterious decoration. "For operations that officially never happened," Elena replied. "Samuel received it for saving 43 children from a trafficking operation in Guatemala. The mission was too sensitive for public recognition, but his superiors wanted him to know his sacrifice mattered." Margaret pinned the medals to her shirt, feeling the weight of Samuel's legacy settling on her shoulders. "How many children are currently depending on the network?" "Hundreds," Maria answered without hesitation, "and thousands more who will need help in the coming years if the routes remain open." Jake called from his observation post. "They're in final positions. We have maybe 5 minutes before they move on the cabin." Margaret looked around the workshop one last time, seeing it now as Samuel's command center, rather than simply a place where he'd built furniture. Every tool, every piece of equipment, every carefully organized supply had served a purpose beyond woodworking. Her grandfather had been preparing for this moment her entire life. "I'm not running," Margaret announced. "This is my family's work, and these mountains belong to people who need protection, not criminals who profit from human misery." Elena's eyes filled with tears of pride and fear. "Are you certain? Once you make this choice, there's no going back to your old life." "My old life was built on lies anyway," Margaret replied. "At least this choice is based on truth." Jake moved away from the window and began distributing weapons from Samuel's cache. "If we're staying, we need to use every advantage Samuel built into this place. Margaret, do you know about the defensive positions?" Margaret shook her head, realizing there were still secrets about the cabin she hadn't discovered. Jake led her to what appeared to be a solid wall panel that opened to reveal a narrow passage leading beneath the cabin's foundation. "Samuel built this place like a fortress," Jake explained as they moved through the hidden passage. "Overlapping fields of fire, reinforced positions, multiple escape routes. He was ready for this day." The passage emerged at a concealed observation post that provided perfect visibility of the approaches to the cabin. Margaret could see at least 10 armed figures moving through the forest, their tactical gear and coordinated movements indicating professional military or law enforcement training. "Carlos Vega hired former Special Forces operators," Elena explained, joining them in the hidden position. "He learned that defeating our network required people with skills equal to Samuel's." Margaret studied the approaching assault team and felt something unexpected. Not fear, but cold determination. These people had murdered her grandfather, threatened her family, and dedicated themselves to destroying humanitarian work that had saved thousands of innocent lives. "What would Samuel do?" she asked Elena. "Protect the mission above all else," Elena replied. "Individual survival matters less than ensuring the network continues." Margaret understood. This wasn't about winning a single battle. It was about preserving the ability to save future lives. The Eagle Protocol would allow the network to be rebuilt, but only if they could prevent Vega's forces from capturing the critical information and personnel that made reconstruction possible. "Jake," Margaret said, "can you and Maria hold them here long enough for Eleanor and me to reach the Eagle site?" Jake checked his weapons and smiled grimly. "Samuel trained me for exactly this scenario. I can buy you the time you need." Maria emerged from the cabin, carrying a pack loaded with essential documents and equipment. "The radio is set to monitor emergency frequencies. If you reach the Eagle site safely, use code Mountain Eagle to signal the network." Margaret took a final look at the cabin that had been her childhood sanctuary and was now becoming a battlefield. In a few minutes, armed criminals would assault the place where Samuel had built furniture, grown vegetables, and quietly saved hundreds of lives. She picked up Samuel's assault rifle, surprised by how natural it felt in her hands. Apparently, her grandfather's lessons had included more practical skills than she'd realized. "For the children," Elena said, checking her own weapon. For Samuel, Margaret replied, moving toward the position that would provide the best coverage for their escape route. 3 weeks after the battle at Samuel's cabin, Margaret stood on the deck of the Eagle Sight facility, watching the sunrise paint the mountain peaks in shades of gold and crimson. The cave system Samuel had prepared as their ultimate refuge had proven everything he'd promised. Secure, well-supplied, and completely hidden from hostile forces, the assault on the cabin had been fierce but brief. Jake and Maria's defensive preparations, combined with Margaret's unexpected tactical skills, had allowed Elena and her to escape through Samuel's carefully planned route, while inflicting enough casualties to discourage immediate pursuit. Carlos Vega's organization had retreated to reassess their strategy, buying precious time for the network to regroup. Elena emerged from the cave entrance carrying 2 cups of coffee, moving with less of the constant alertness that had marked her behavior during the crisis. The morning radio check confirms that all evacuation routes are functioning normally, she reported. 17 children reached safety yesterday, including the family from Honduras we were most worried about. Margaret accepted the coffee gratefully, still adjusting to the reality of her new life. The corporate consulting business she'd built in Charleston was now permanently behind her, along with her apartment, her social circles, and every aspect of the existence she'd constructed over 32 years. Any regrets? Elena asked, settling into a chair beside her granddaughter. About the choice? None, Margaret replied honestly. About the years we lost because of necessary deceptions? Every day they sat in comfortable silence, watching the mountain wilderness that had become Margaret's new home and headquarters. The Eagle Sight included living quarters, communication facilities, supply storage, and workshop space where she'd begun learning to maintain the equipment that kept the rescue network operational. A sound from the valley below caught their attention. Elena tensed automatically, but Margaret recognized the engine signature of Jake's truck making its weekly supply run. He'd volunteered to serve as liaison between the Eagle Sight and the external world, managing logistics and intelligence gathering, while Margaret and Elena coordinated rescue operations. But today, Jake wasn't alone. As his truck climbed the narrow mountain road, Margaret could see 2 additional passengers in the vehicle. Elena studied them through binoculars and gasped softly. "Margaret," she said, her voice filled with emotion, "I think you're about to meet your parents." Margaret's heart began racing as Jake's truck reached the concealed entrance to the Eagle Sight. She'd known this moment would eventually come, but the reality of meeting the parents she'd mourned for 20 years felt overwhelming. How did you greet people who'd been forced to let you believe they were dead? The truck stopped, and Jake emerged first, followed by a man and woman Margaret recognized from the photographs Elena had shown her. Miguel Santos Carter appeared to be in his early 60s, with graying hair and her own dark eyes. Carmen Elena Rodriguez Carter was smaller than Margaret had expected, but her posture radiated the same quiet strength Margaret remembered admiring in Eleanor. For a moment, the 4 people simply stood looking at each other across 20 years of enforced separation. Then Carmen stepped forward with tears streaming down her face. "Mi hija," she whispered, using the Spanish endearment Margaret had never heard applied to herself. "You've grown into such a beautiful, strong woman." Margaret found herself embracing parents who were strangers but felt immediately familiar. Miguel's hands were calloused from manual labor, and Carmen smelled of the same cedar soap Samuel had always used. These were her people, her family, finally reunited despite the criminal forces that had tried to destroy them. "We've watched you from distance for so many years," Miguel said, his English accented but clear. "Your achievements, your marriage, your independence. We were so proud, but also so heartbroken that we couldn't be part of your life." Margaret stepped back to study their faces, searching for resemblances and trying to reconcile these living people with the idealized memories of dead parents she'd carried for decades. "I have so many questions, and we have years of stories to share," Carmen replied. "But first, we want to understand what you've chosen. Elena told us you decided to continue Samuel's work." Margaret nodded, gesturing toward the Eagle Sight facility that had become her new home. Someone has to protect the children. Samuel and Elena built something too important to let it die with them. Miguel smiled, and Margaret saw her own determination reflected in his expression. Then we've chosen correctly. Carmen and I want to help. Our identities are secure enough now to allow limited involvement, and we have skills the network can use. Elena produced a small digital camera and positioned the family group together against the mountain backdrop. Samuel always said that family was worth any sacrifice, she said, taking photographs that documented their reunion. He would be so proud to see us together, continuing the work he dedicated his life to. As Margaret stood between her parents with Elena beside them, she realized that Samuel's final gift hadn't been the Eagle Protocol or the rescue network. It had been the restoration of the family that criminal forces had tried to destroy, now reunited in service to something larger than themselves.